Hello, I'm George C. Wolfe, and this is My Life in the Theater. I'm going to open up this book, and there's the Colored Museum. I started working on the Colored Museum when I was a student and in the MFA program. I was in the dramatic writing program, and I was in the musical theater program. I wrote a musical that was going to be a big, big, big hit. And then I wrote a play that was just for myself. The musical that I wrote to be a big, big hit was not a big, big hit. And the show that I wrote for myself was The Colored Museum, which changed my career. It started out at Crossroads. It ended up at the Public Theater. Morgan Jeunesse, who was a very influential energy in my life, was a huge champion of it. It was done in the Shiva, started on the Shiva Theater, then it went to the Newman, and Joe Papp and Gail Papp became very passionate about the show. And then it ended up going to the Royal Court, and then it ended up going to LA, and then it ended up going all over the place. And I remember when it first went into previews, it was a startling kind of play because it was satire, and a lot of people were thrown by it and freaked out by it. And I remember somebody came into audition and was so horrified by what it was, they threw the script down and said, "I'm not going to audition for this." And then there was a few protests at the beginning, and it's so fascinating that something that I wrote just for me turned into this other thing that's had this extraordinary life. So I'm very proud of it. And I love the cast. I love the original cast. Loretta Devine, Vicki Lynn Reynolds, Denitra Vance, Reggie Montgomery, and Tommy Hollis. Loved them. And we traveled and had so much fun together. So that was the Colored Museum. And that really sort of launched my career. I did a brief review of the Manhattan Theater Club called Urban Blight. I wrote a skit for it, and it was fine. It was fine. I don't remember too much. Then after Colored Museum, I did Spunk, which is a collection of Zora Neale Hurston stories. Colored Museum had a very incredible biting edge and energy to it, and I wanted to do something very, very different. So I chose to adapt 3 short stories by Zora Neale Hurston, and Denitra Vance, who was in the Colored Museum, was the connective tissue because she played all 3 women in all 3 of these short stories, for lack of better words. And Chick Street Men did the music, and it's the first time I worked with Ann Duquesne. And it was a lovely piece. Once again, it had a life at Crossroads that then moved to the Public Theater, that then moved to the Royal Court, that then moved to LA. So it was a lovely, lovely, lovely piece, and I'm very proud of it. And while I was working on Colored Museum, I got all these offers. I got a lot of TV offers, I got a lot of movie offers, and I had all the meetings, and I would go to the Russian tea room and meet people and do all this sort of stuff. But at the end of the day, I ended up doing none of that, and I ended up working on this show that was going to be about Jelly Roll Morton. And it went through a bumpy journey to get there. Gregory Hines and I met, and we didn't get along at all. And then the show was done at the Mark Taper Forum, and I realized I needed him, and he came to see it at the Taper, and he was excited. And then we continued our complicated journey until we came out on the other side. And I grew to love him in the role, and he grew to love it, and we grew to love each other. And it was a glorious experience. And I'm very proud of that cast. And I think it was one of, just visually, they were some of the most stunning human beings, the most stunning, gorgeous cast I think that has ever been on Broadway in the history of Broadway. I say that with pride because I love them dearly. After I finished Jelly, I realized this is hard. This is my first Broadway show. And I said, this is really, really hard. You have to be really tough. And so I thought about maybe I should become a producer as well as a director and a writer, but nobody knew that I was a director yet. And so I started working on Jelly as a book writer. And I was not the director of it. And then I did Spunk, and then people said, oh, he can direct. So then I ended up directing Jelly, and it was just a lovely, lovely experience. And as a result of Jelly, I remember I received a phone call one day and said, Tony Kushner wants to come talk to you about his play Angels in America. And it was, it was the thing that everybody was talking about, and it literally out of the blue. They said, Tony wants to come talk to you. And he came over. I was living up on 95th Street, and he came over, and we talked, I think, about maybe 2, 3, 4 hours. And a couple of days later, or I think it was a couple of days later, a few days later, somebody called back and said he wants you to direct it. And it was just sort of like this wonderful, astonishing, amazing, like glorious gift that just dropped into my lap. I didn't go searching for it. I didn't hustle for it. All of a sudden, I'm working on this great, great play dealing with this extraordinary cast. And it was just it was challenging. It was challenging. And one of my biggest jobs I felt on that show was because the hype and the expectation was so large. I think one of the things that I felt, in addition to directing it and delving into to helping Tony on the rewrite, not helping him as in writing it, but helping as in making him feel safe so that he could complete it, was protecting the cast and the creative team from all the expectations that people had. As a matter of fact, a Hollywood producer at the time told me, well, everybody knows the play is brilliant, so if it doesn't work, it's your fault. Anyway, welcome to Broadway. While I was at the Public Theater, and Joseph Papp was there, I was given a season to stage plays. Michael Grive, David Greenspan, Joanna Acolytus were all given seasons, and while I was working on Jelly, I was going to do a new play and it didn't work out. So I did a series called Moving Beyond the Madness, in which I invited individual artists to come and create work. And one of the artists that I invited to come work there was Anna DeVere Smith. And we talked about doing something about Crown Heights, what had just happened in Crown Heights. And that turned into Fires in the Mirror. And then after that, she went to work on a piece about the insurrection that had happened in Los Angeles around the Rodney King verdict. And that turned into Twilight Los Angeles, and it ended up coming to the Public Theater and then had a run on Broadway. And by that time, I got involved as a director of it. So I feel very proud of championing Anna at this point, which is very early in her career. I remember when I was in college and I started writing and directing plays, this student, whose name I couldn't begin to remember, at one point said to me, "You should direct The Tempest." I was like, I think I was a junior in college. He said, "You should direct The Tempest one day." I went, "Oh, okay." And I said, "Okay, whatever." And then many years later, I'm at the Public, and then I never directed a Shakespeare play before. And so I went, okay. And I didn't think about him, but in retrospect, I later thought about him saying that. And so I directed The Tempest in the Park, and Patrick Stewart was Prospero, and this cast was filled with so many new young people that had just gotten out of acting school. Carrie Preston, Ingenue Ellis, Rainn Wilson was in it, Marion Hinkle, all these people who have gone on to have these wonderful careers. And it was done outside, and I worked with Hope Clark, who I'd worked with a number of times. And I was going to Brazil a lot these times, a lot during those days. So it was staged outside, and there were people on stilts, and it was a very, very exciting production, and the cast was extraordinary. And there was just something about being outside that made that piece soar. We ended up moving it to Broadway, and it had a very healthy run. But there was something about being in the elements, the wind, the intensity. I remember at one point, during one performance in the park, when Prospero surrendered his power, there was an electric storm that happened. And somehow nature just kept on blessing us with that show. Noise Funk was a little bit later in the season. I'd gotten to know Savion from Jelly, and one of the first people when I became the producer of the Public Theater, people say the artistic director. I was not the artistic director, I was the producer, just a little thing of mine. And while I was producer, I asked certain people, I said, "Come, if you want to do something, come down to the Public." And one of those people was Savion Glover. And we started working on this piece, and I wanted to explore something, how the relationship between history and rhythm. And also, I remember at the time, George Hayward, who was on the board of the Public Theater, took me to a New York Knicks game. And I was really fascinated by how, from the beginning of the game to the end, it was all propelled by rhythm. You know, the two teams playing opposite each other, scoring, then the crowd would cheer, and then they would do da-da-da-da-da, and the crowd would go, yeah, ba-da-da. And I just saw the whole game. You know, I was completely and totally mesmerized that wouldn't it be fun to create a show where rhythm rhythm is driving the audience the entire time. And when you're playing with someone like Savion, who is a master of rhythm, i.e. tap dancing, but also just understanding rhythm anyway, it was fun. It was a show that happened. The working on that show was sort of miraculous. My mother was very ill and dying, and so the planet felt very unshaked. It felt like a not very safe place to me. So every morning, every morning, I'd get together with the guys and a team of people working who would be doing research, and Daryl and Zane who would be doing the music, and Ann Ducanay from Spunk, who is now a part of this, and Reggie Gaines, who was a poet, and we'd start playing and just start working, and the show grew instantaneously. And a lot of the numbers I would dream about the night before and come in and go, what if we tried this? What if we tried this? Because I think at the time, the show was the only safe place I felt in the planet because of what was going on with my mother. On the Town was a show that I did in the park, which I loved working on a lot. And then we moved to the Gershwin, which used to be the Uris, which has been home to Wicked for 9,000 years. And it did not last long, and it was too big of a theater, and it was glorious and wonderful in the park, but the dynamic, it was just too large of a space for it. So that was that. Wild Party, I got to work with Michael John LaChiusa on this piece that was based on this poem that ended up in the New Yorker, or was published by the New Yorker by Joseph Moncure March. I believe I've got the name right. And I thought that I had seen a number of pieces that Michael John had done. And when he brought in and shared the material, I fell in love with it, and I fell in love with the cast. And it was, I think, so dark and so edgy and so smart and so savvy. I'd also recently read a book by Ann Douglas called Terrible Honesty, and the subtitle, I believe, was Mongrel Manhattan. And that informed a lot of my thinking of working on that show. And in some respects, it was a very interesting thing, because just when we were opened up on Broadway, it was a few years before 9/11 happened. And at one point, it became very clear to me we were all working on a post 9/11 show, pre 9/11. And there was there were many stunning moments of it, but there was a stunning moment when Eartha Kitt, the legendary, the astonishing, the powerful Eartha Kitt, sang a song called When It Ends, all about confronting the possibility of no possibility and the power and the strength that you need to survive. I did a panel. John Lahr asked me to do a panel for the New Yorker Festival, and there were other people on the panel, and there was Elaine Stritch, and I don't remember anybody else who was on the panel, but I do remember Elaine. And afterwards, after we were on the panel, she came up to me and said, "People tell me I should work with you." I said, "Oh, okay." And so I invited her down to the Public Theater to work on her one-person show, which she worked on with John Lahr, called Elaine Stritch at Liberty. And I remember at the time I was working on Topdog, Underdog, and while that was in development that summer, I would go out to Sag Harbor, or I would go to the Regency, where Elaine and John would work, and we discussed structure and everything. And I remember for my birthday, when we started working on the show in earnest, Elaine got free peanut butter cookies from the Regency, put them in a black Tupperware container, and gave them to me for my birthday, and said, "Dear George, happy birthday, make me brilliant." And that was her present to me. And once again, interestingly enough, the first day of rehearsal was supposed to be 9/11. And she called me up in true Elaine Stritch fashion and went, "I guess we're not starting today." So that was that. And it was fascinating working with somebody like her who who was so tough on herself and getting the word, getting the pause, getting the comma, getting the impulse right, and watching her rigor and watching her passion and how she would just drive herself. We had a wonderful collaboration. She's a very complicated person, and I adored her dearly. Very complicated. Like I said, while I was working in the beginning phrases of Elaine Stritch at Liberty, Susan Laurie wrote Topdog, Underdog, and it started down at the Public Theater with Jeffrey Wright, a person who I've collaborated with probably more than any other actor, and Don Cheadle. And we did it during the summer, and it was supposed to move to Broadway. God, this is a lot of 9/11 coming up. And then it was supposed to move to Broadway in the fall, but that didn't happen because of 9/11, and the city was going through, how do we continue? Once again, going back to Elaine Stritch, going back to Eartha Kitt singing When It Ends. And so what's next, what's next? And then it ended up moving to Broadway, and most Def, Yassine Bey, took over the role, and it was Jeffrey and Mos Def. And we ended up performing it at the Ambassador. Susan Laurie won the Pulitzer for it. And we ended up going to the Royal Court where it played, which was very exciting and a lot of fun. And then there was a brief West Coast tour. And it's a lovely, 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 smart play. And it recently had a revival on Broadway, which I'm glad about. Carolina Change also started at the Public. Tony and I were looking for something to work together on. He had a play called Henry Box Brown that we were talking about doing, but that didn't end up happening. But then he wrote this play called Carolina Change. And I remember at one point we did a reading of it. We used to have a festival at the Public called New Work Now, and we did it with an audience, and the actors just reading it. And I think Ann Duquesne and Chuck Cooper just sort of improvised the singing, but it was just a very informal thing. And then later, Janine Tesori got involved, and we took a lovely amount of time working on it. Was able to give Janine some money so she could go away and play. And she wrote Act One, and then she'd come back, and then we'd share it with X number of people, very informal. And then she'd go off and work on Act Two. And it started at the Public. And then later on, it moved to Broadway. And it's a piece that I think is an astonishing piece of work, and I'm very proud of the work on it. And everybody, the full cast was miraculous. The full cast. Alice Playton was in it, who was glorious, and Tanya Pinkins was, I think, astonishingly brilliant as Caroline, and Harrison Chad, the whole cast, Marva Hicks, everybody, Ramona Keller,
Anika Nani Rose, Chandra Wilson, Vianne Cox were brilliant as well.
Everybody. It was just a lovely, 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 lovely experience working on it. It had a very short life on Broadway, which I think was a shame, because I think it was a masterpiece. And it later came back with a production from England. I think it's a masterpiece. I think it's truly a masterpiece. Free Man of Color, once again, I worked with Jeffrey Wright. It was originally going to be at the Public, and then through a series of circumstances, it ended up not at the Public, and it ended up at Lincoln Center. And I think it's a breathtakingly brilliant play. And it's written by John Guare. And I remember when I was 18 years old, I was a lowly apprentice at the Williamstown Theater Festival, and they were doing a John Guare play called Rich and Famous, and I was in the cast. And it's so interesting because so many people who I ended up meeting that summer when I was lowly apprentice, I ended up working with, including Ron Liebman, who was in Angels in America and was also in Rich and Famous. And so we did this play, and it started out with me calling John into my office and saying, I've always wanted to do a restoration piece, and I've always wanted to set it in a city like New York or Charleston, where race and class and money and power all collide. And he went off and wrote this astonishing piece of theater called Free Man of Color. And I'm very, very, very proud of it. I remember being very profoundly disappointed that the piece wasn't celebrated as much as it deserved. And I was going through a period where I was feeling very disillusioned because I was going, anytime I brought something to Broadway, I felt like I should always be, because it takes so much work to bring something there, that I should always show up with something that is challenging and interesting and provocative and questioning, and Free Men of Color did that. And then I was beginning to wonder, well, maybe that's not possible anymore. And then while I was in the middle of my cynical sadness, Del Roth and Joe Mantello called me up and said, oh, we did a reading of The Normal Heart, which Joel Gray was involved in as director, and we want to bring it to Broadway. And would you consider taking it on? And I went, sure, I'll help out. And it was just literally, I'll help out. And I remember we ended up doing it. I think we had 2 weeks of rehearsal. We had an insanely limited amount of time. We did 2 weeks with an incredible cast, literally 2 weeks, and we worked very rigorously, and miraculously, everybody ended up off book, and we had 2 previews, and I think 1 day of tech, and then we opened up, and it turned into this miraculous event, and Larry Kramer, the dear, incredible Larry Kramer, would hand out a flyer about how AIDS is still with us. And it was so interesting because with that audience, it was comprised of people who had gone through the AIDS crisis and survived, and it was allowed them to release some of the feelings that they couldn't release. And then there was all this new energy of very young gay men who were learning a story that they knew but didn't really know. And all the cynicism that I was feeling about, I don't know, why am I doing shows on Broadway anymore? All of that went away with doing The Normal Heart, because the electric energy that was happening in the Golden Theater, and the electric energy that was happening from that cast, led by Joe Mantello, Ellen Bark, and John Benjamin Hickey, and I'm going to forget other names and not mention them, but it was a stunning study. Jim Parsons, it was a stunning cast. Just revitalized my belief that the marketplace can still handle subject matter that is daring and challenging and tough and smart. So in one season, I was left uncertain, and then by the end of that season, I did The Normal Heart, and it ended up winning Best Revival and a number of other awards. So that's that. Lucky Guy is a play that I worked on with Nora Ephron. She would come to my house, and she had a history of working on it. She started out working on it with Mike Nichols. She'd worked on it with a number of people. Then Tom Hanks was connected to it, and so what ended up happening is that Nora would come to my house, and we'd sit there, and I'd give her a ton of notes, and then she'd go away, and then she'd come back, and we'd do this sometimes 2-3 times a week. We did a reading of it that ended up going very, very well. Courtney Vance was involved, just a lovely cast. Mara Tierney, all just a wonderful cast. Danny Massagiorgio, and so we talked about going forward. And then I was working on a museum in Atlanta, and I was at the airport. No, this was before that. I was working on it, and I had to go down there because there was having a groundbreaking ceremony for this museum that I was connected with. And then the night before, I got this call from Brian Lord from CAA, and I was talking to a friend who was on the phone, and she was going through a crisis, so I didn't pick up. And I went, okay, why is he calling me so late? And then the next morning, very early, I got a call, and he said, Nora's very sick. And I went, what? I want to go see her. He said, no, she's in essence dying. And she didn't want anybody to know. She told her people in her family and no one else. And then I later found out that someone told me that when she would come to my house, she would sit there. I would give her notes. She was doing chemo, so that she would then leave and work as much as she could. And the entire time that I was giving her notes and she was doing the work, she was going through chemo. So it was just startling. And I remember I ended up going to some screening of a film at MoMA. This was clearly much earlier on, and I bumped into her, and someone said, oh, let's take a picture of the two of you. And And I remember her looking at me and said, "The first of many," because we had announced that we were going to go to Broadway, and we posed, and that was the only picture we ever took together. And it was just so startling that I still don't quite understand what that experience was about. I know what the play was about, but to have this very charged, very intense experience of helping her with this play and then feeling this guardianship of it, and making sure that I saw it through, and I think Tom felt the same way, and all of us who were involved felt the same way, of making sure that this play was done. And Colin Callender was the producer, and it was just once again, it was sort of like it came from nowhere. It came from nowhere. I was not going, I want to work on a play about a newspaper man, nor did I want to do a play that's going to win the Pulitzer called Angels in America. There were periodically, or Normal Heart, there were periodically these projects would just sort of, I would be going through whatever I was going through in life, or questioning this, or figuring out this, or solving this, and running the public, or leaving the public, or whatever. And then all of a sudden, there would just be a project that would take me on a journey. And I remember at one point realizing, oh, I'm not in charge of my career. My career is in charge of my career. And these plays or these projects would just plop into my life. And they would be gifts that would end up teaching me or giving me some understanding of about myself, or the world that I was a part of, that I didn't even think I needed to go on the journey to discover, but it ended up giving me. And so it ended up being a gift where I gave my talent and my passion to the project, and the project gave something for me as well. So Shuffle Along was a project that I deeply loved and was very personal to me, probably in many respects as personal to me in terms of Broadway shows as Jelly's Last Jam was. Because on a number of projects, I felt this incredible sense of responsibility, and through the course of working on the project, I felt a sense of ownership. But there was something that I cared deeply about Shuffle Along. I remember in college I was reading, Josephine Baker kind of connected to this show, Shuffle Along. Paul Robeson, Shuffle Along. And these fragments started to converge, and then Cecil and Blake, Shuffle Along. And all these pieces just started to connect. And this woman named Florence Mills, who became this international star, Shuffle Along. So I started digging in and doing research, and I discovered that it was this show that opened up in the early 20s and completely redefined Broadway, brought syncopation to Broadway. And I also had this old history book from the 40s about shows on Broadway. And by that time, I'd figured out how influential Shuffle Along was. And I became really intrigued. And then when I looked at this book, it had a list of all the shows that had happened on Broadway in the 1920 season. And then at the bottom, it had, and also included Shuffle Along. So I was very intrigued that this history book that was written in the 30s or the 40s about Broadway, that in the 20s, Shuffle Along was one of the big hits of the season. And by the time it made it to the 1940s, it was inconsequential in terms of the storytelling of what happened on Broadway that season. So I became very invested in making sure this story was told. And I worked once again with Savion, and I invited Audrey McDonald to become involved, and a number of people, Brian Stokes Mitchell and Billy Porter and Brandon Victor Dixon and Josh Henry
And Adrienne Warren.
We just started working and development, and it opened up on Broadway. And I was very, 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 very proud of the show. And it ended up having a short life, and a much shorter life than it should have. And its closing sort of broke my heart in a really substantive way. And I think everybody who worked on the show, it broke a lot of hearts. And it's very interesting to become involved in something that was about the fragility that is involved in making a show. And we made the show, and in the process of making it, it magnified the fragility and was a direct reflection of the experience that happened, I believe, to the people when they originally made Shuffle Along. So it was a piece that I cared and still care greatly about. In retrospect, I think one of the most important shows I ever worked on, even though it had a very short life, because it should not have had a short life. But I'm very proud of it. And interestingly enough, I'm going to skip out of order. And working with Audra on that show, she and I had gotten to know each other as friends. And then I asked her to get involved, and she came involved. And then about 3 or 4 years ago, she came to me and said, I want to do Gypsy and I want you to direct it. And I was directing film at the time. And I said, well, let me figure out how it could work. And then she was doing other things. We were doing other things. And then finally I finished the film Rustin around the same time that her schedule had cleared. And so we ended up doing Gypsy together. And that's how it happened. And it's been really, really fascinating working on the show. And also there are these threads that run through, because when I was in the NYU musical theater program, which was a very complicated program for me to be involved in, read the book when I write it, and one of the teachers was Arthur Lawrence. And one of the people he was one of the people who very early on, he along with Peter Stone and a number of people, Richard Maltby also, who were champions of me and my work very early on. And they fought to get me agents, and they suggested me to write the book for shows. And they were huge champions of my career before I even had a career. And so it's so interesting to me and very fulfilling to me that I find myself now directing a revival of Gypsy with Audra, who was connected with on Shuffle Along, harkening back to Arthur, who was a huge champion of mine. So there are these threads that keep on weaving through. And the more shows you do, the more you find yourself inside the stories of the shows, and the more the shows help you become who you become, and you hopefully help them become what they're going to become. So that's really, really fascinating to me. At one point, after Shuffle Along, Scott Rudin called me up and said, Denzel wants to do a play. He wants you to direct it. I want to do the play with him, and I want you to direct it. And we talked about sorted plays. And then we ended up doing a production of Iceman Cometh. Great cast, wonderful cast. And I remember in college, reading O'Neill and going, yeah. And then, then when I did Iceman Cometh, I turned into yeah. And I fell in love. I fell in love with the play and with the production and working on it. And so it was a very, I was very proud. I was very proud of that production. And also I worked with Sandra LaQuasto and Ann Roth, two people who I'd worked with on Shuffle Along. So it allowed us to continue our working relationship. And then the next project I worked on was Gary, a sequel to Titus Andronicus, which interestingly enough is one of, if not my favorite Shakespeare play. And I always said, one day I'm going to direct Titus Andronicus. And then I have never directed Titus Andronicus. I don't think I will direct Titus Andronicus, but I got to work with Taylor Mack. Working with Taylor Mack on Gary was a very interesting journey, because I think he's really an incredibly smart writer. And we ended up at the Booth, which is a theater that I always wanted to work with. I think it's a really smart, wonderful play. It's one of the few plays that I wish I had started somewhere else and then warranted a move, which is not to say it didn't warrant a move because of the talent of all the people involved, but I think it would have been interesting to give it a chance to find the following that it deserved. I talked briefly earlier about urban blight. This happened because after Colored Museum, I was invited to contribute to this review, and it was a portrait of where the country was, for lack of better words, and And so I came up with this, and it was a skit. It was a skit about a Good Morning America type 2 talk show people talking about the problems of the world, but they didn't have to worry because it was over there. Whatever, starvation, wars, poverty was over there. And then the subject of AIDS came up. And then they realized that it was no longer over there. It was getting closer and closer. And it ended up with them taking saran wrap and trying to wrap themselves in it to try to protect them from something that was coming closer and closer and closer. And it was sort of very, very raw and very burlesque. And I haven't read it in such a long time. But it was sort of, interestingly enough, I think how the city was feeling, that something that was sort of there kept getting closer and closer and closer and closer until it became, a defining reality for all of our lives, for any number of people who were living in New York at the time, and the lives and the friends that we lost, and the effect and the impact that it had on the Broadway community cannot be underestimated. The question is, what makes mine different from other gypsies? And it's an interesting question, and a question I have no interest in answering, because, there's a brilliant line in Sunday in the Park with George: stop worrying if your vision is new, let others make that decision, they usually do. So I didn't go, I'm going to make this different. The thing which is and I would also, it's very interesting, the first day of rehearsal, we read through the script. Read every piece of dialogue, every piece of dialogue, every song as if it were text. Audra and I and Andy Ihorn and I had gone through, had met in my place, and we'd gone through almost all of her songs. We'd gone through all of her songs and talked about them dramaturgically, what's going on. But we treated it like a play. And I would argue that Gypsy is an incredible play that is periodically sung. I think it's so smart and so brilliantly written. And if you dig into the material, there's one of my favorite moments after the scene in Grand Singers in which Rose blows up an opportunity for her daughter June to have a career. One of the sisters says to the other one, "Do you sometimes think you don't have a sister?" And then Louise says, "Sometimes." And it's such a and that line opened up the door to what that scene was really about, what that song is really about. Because it's interesting, because it could, if Mama Was Married, could be, considered a charm song, but it's not. It's a song that I think is about anger, because all of a sudden these two sisters realize what this mother's complicated love has done to them. The consequences of that. And it's a song where they actually, for the first time, actually get to know each other. And the depth of that level of development that is underneath the song, that is underneath the scene, is really quite extraordinary. And so what I set out to do, and what everybody working on the piece set out to do, was to dig as deeply as we possibly could. And it's called a musical fable, which is perfectly fine, but I consider it an American fable. And interestingly enough, when I first started working on it, I kept on hearing Elaine Stritch's voice, and I remember at one point when we started out with Elaine Stritch at Liberty at the Newman at the Public Theater, and then we moved to, I believe, the Neil Simon. And it was the first night there, and I was talking to somebody, and Elaine was on the stage, and I saw her pacing back and forth, sort of like a caged animal, just pacing and pacing and pacing. And I was talking to somebody, and she yelled out, "George!" And I went, "Yeah." She said, "Is this stage bigger than the Newman?" And I went, "Yeah." And she kept pacing, and then she went, "I like it." And it just finally, she was on the Newman, and she was wonderful, and the show was beautiful on the Newman. But finally, the creature that she is, the force that she was, had more space. And that, to me, is what Gypsy was about all the characters not having enough, not enough, not enough love, not enough money, not enough protection, not enough safety, and all the characters are searching for something that they will not necessarily get. And if they do get it, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's solving everything that they haven't had up to that point in time. And so that was very interesting to me. It was also very interesting to me that all of the key creators on the piece had gone through the Depression, and that was an aspect of the show. So I was very, very intrigued by the American landscape, and I was also very fascinated by the fact that as various ethnic groups, which is a kind of weird phrase, but I just used it. Various ethnic groups, when they arrive in this country, or if they've been stuck in this country, inside of the rigidity of the system that is, boxing and entertainment are two of the forms where they can ascend. Jewish boxers, and then Italian boxers, then Irish boxers, and then Black American boxers, and then Caribbean boxers, and then Latin boxers. And then the same thing is entertainment. How do you break through the rigidity of America? It's frequently in boxers and frequently through entertainment. So it became, and when Audra came to me and wanted to do it and was interested in playing the role, it became interesting just to explore the full tapestry of what that meant, And I was also very intrigued by the fact that people kept on calling Rose a monster. She's not exactly going to win Mother of the Year, but was she a monster because in 1959, there's dialogue that is written where she says, she's rejecting the options that are available for her, which is to be somebody's wife. She decides she's not going to do that. So I was just very intrigued by, is that monster label because of when the musical was done? How does that apply, and how doesn't that apply? And so we went digging and digging and digging. So I'm sure it's different. I've seen a number of them, but I'm less interested in not how it's different from other shows, but I'm very excited by what we were able to find and what I was able to find and what excited me about the material and what excited the cast about the material, and mining it for the texture. Because anytime I've done a musical, or most of the musical that I've done, I've always been interested in how that which is on the edge of American society ends up center stage, and how by virtue of it ending up center stage, it redefines the definition of what center stage is. So I've always been fascinated by that. What I love about theater, I love the community of making theater. I love that a bunch of people who don't necessarily know each other come to know each other very well, at times too well. But if you can create the right environment, they come into the room and they offer up the best of who they are, and they create a story or a show or a world or a landscape that hopefully empowers the people who come to see it, because that's what I think theater is about. Theater is about the journey of empowerment for an audience. And so I love that. I've always been obsessed with making theater. I came to New York when I was 14 with my mother. My mother was doing some advanced degree work at NYU. And I saw a production of Hello, Dolly with Pearl Bailey and Cap Calloway. I saw a production of West Side Story at the State Theater at the time at Lincoln Center. And I saw, interestingly enough, a production of Hamlet with Cleavon Little in Washington Square Park that Joe Papp had directed. And in some respects, I think I can see aspects of my aesthetic that evolved from those three shows. It was so interesting. I remember to this day vividly seeing the production of Hamlet and seeing it in the rawness of Washington Square Park and seeing it with the groundlings, because that's what was going on. And the energy and the dynamic that was going on between the audience and between the actors was so visceral and New York and unapologetically New York, that I think that really informed my thinking. And I was obsessed with making theater. It's interesting. And I remember I was working on a show about Keith Haring called Radiant Baby down at the Public Theater. It had lots of projections and all over the place. And then Mostaf Yassin Bey came to see it. He said, "Go direct a film." He said, you've got so many visuals, just go and direct a film. And so it's been interesting because I think I've done like 4 or 5 films since then. A play that I commissioned for Ruben Santiago Hudson's called Lackawanna Blues ended up becoming the first film that I directed. When I started directing film, I realized that I learned the muscularity of the job of directing film from doing musicals. And because I tell people directing a musical is like landing at Normandy. You've got to organize, you've got to be ready, you've got to build a machine so that you're ready to take it on. An interesting fact about Jelly, it was my first Broadway show. This was pre-internet and pre all those gossip little .coms that exist where they talk about theater. And none of that existed. And we were in previews, and they were very brutal previews. Certain things were working really well, and certain things were not working at all. And the creative team, which was Susan Birkenhead and Luther Henderson and Hope Clark, and then Gregory and Savion were working on the creation of it. And at one point, through the course of a week, while continuing to perform the show, we put in 6 new numbers. We put in 6 new numbers in previews, and I did it because I didn't know that was crazy. I just knew, oh, I got to fix this, so I got to work on this. Oh, I know what I should do here. Oh, that's got to go. That's got to go. And I remember somebody, because this was pre-internet, somebody sent a telegram to me, courtesy of the Virginia Theater, now the August Wilson Theater. And I went, oh, somebody sent me a telegram. I had opened it up, and someone said, "Dear George Wolfe, don't let your ego destroy this show," it was just sort of like so fascinating, because that had never happened when I'd done shows down at the Public or wherever I'd done them. And I just realized, oh, people feel this ownership because they're paying money, and I guess because of all the lights, that they can write and say and do whatever they want. And I'm glad they feel that way, and they can go to hell, because that has nothing to do with the making of a show. The making of a show is people putting their hearts on the line, putting forth their best, and previews are called previews because that's where you're figuring it out. And one of the things that I always tell the actors when we go into previews, I said, we have been going on a journey, and finally our final scene partner is showing up, and that's the audience. And we are here to learn from them. We are not their victim, they are ours. And we are going on this journey together. And it's sort of, when I look back on it, I've had a really blessed career, not because of the successes that I've experienced, but because of the glorious, astonishing artists that I've worked with, but also the things that it's taught me about myself, and and the people it's allowed me to celebrate and to get to know and collaborate with. And there have been sort of gloriously wonderful journeys that started glorious and became complicated. There were journeys that were very tough and hard and brutal that ended up glorious. And so it's about the discovery. It's about becoming empowered, making actors and artists and designers feel empowered so that you can make an audience feel empowered. And that's some of my shows.